I'm here today just to talk about recent work that we've been doing on what's soon to be launched, the Eperis SDK, which is a blockchain development environment that builds on top of the work we've been doing over the last few years. So fundamentally, the problem we're trying to address is the difficulties for doing blockchain development. Of course, when people are familiar with smart contracts and so on and so forth, then it's fine. You've got your head around the paradigm and everything else. But when you think to where the majority of developers are, which is kind of that Web 2 world, it's quite a different story when they look at blockchain. And I like to think of it in terms of a funnel. Sales and marketing people, they love thinking in terms of funnels for customer acquisition. But there's a lot of analogies between like a traditional funnel and when you think about the experience for a developer actually getting used to the technology. So there's all these different steps that they need to do, like think about what blockchain they're running, connect to a node, there's the whole key management piece and funding these wallets. Then on top of that, they need to actually write the smart contract, test the smart contract, figure out how they're going to deploy the smart contract. And at every single one of those stages, you have the potential for drop-off. And so, of course, with content, and when people are writing marketing content, they're thinking about converting people. But it's exactly the same with developers. If someone's looking at blockchain, I just want to scratch the surface. And then all of a sudden they're saying, okay, install this framework, then you need to connect to a node. And if they're not determined to learn about blockchain, they're not going to. There's just like too many stages that they need to go down. And that's what we're trying to solve. So from the perspective of a developer, when they want to actually work with Ethereum, the starting point will be they need to create a new project, then they need to write a smart contract, figure out how they do the testing component of it, again, integrate whatever library they're working with it, then deploy it, and then, if everything works out, and, they pray to the right gods, it, might work first time. And then following that, there's also the notion of monitoring, which I don't think tends to ever come into the equation because it's just like, there's already all this stuff they've got to do there. And so this is what we're trying to achieve with the Eperis SDK, is to take away all of that complexity for developers, basically. And so at its heart, we've distilled it down into, what's the minimum amount of effort that someone can make to actually create their first blockchain application and deploy it to a live network. And so there's 3 commands in our view for this. First of all, you need to actually install your CLI. Developers love CLIs. Generally, the CLI gives them the most flexibility for actually doing whatever the work they want to be able to do. So once you've got that CLI installed, then you actually want to create your application, and then finally you want to be able to run it. And that's kind of it. Yes, maybe you could do everything in one command, but I think you want to at least give some pointers to what's happening at each stage. And so that's really the 3 steps is how we see it. And so behind the scenes, the areas that we need to think about here, it's of course the project generation, how you compile the smart contracts, integrate your app, the testing, the deployment and the monitoring. I'm going to touch on some of those today. I'm not going to touch on all of them, but I think along the way we've developed some very interesting technologies which I'm going to share some of the details of now. So the first one, creating a new project is Eperis new command. We'll create all of the scaffolding for your project. It's fairly self-explanatory, but the pieces within that will be like your smart contract, your unit tests, application code, and build and deployment configuration. There's also the question of what you actually want to use as your, your first smart contract that you, ever dabble with in blockchain. And so here, the most obvious candidate, of course, is a Hello World one. Now, behind the scenes, we've got the ability to integrate with existing projects, but for someone who's brand new to this, a Hello World's like the standard, and in our views, it makes a lot of sense. And then from there, you can gradually iterate and provide slightly more complex, concepts for them to work with. Okay, and then there's the actual application integration piece. So you need, some sort of layer here which actually talks to, in this case, the Ethereum network, but talks to your blockchain network. So for that, we build on top of Web3j, which has been going since 2016. It's got a decent amount of traction, supports all of the, the enterprise focused in Ethereum. clients as well, and we've had some really great validations with it, like Samsung in their blockchain SDK they released last year, they use Web3j for the Ethereum piece. Opera in their mobile browser on Android, they use Web3j for the integration with Ethereum there as well. So it's stood the test of time, and it's a well-proven library with a lot of contributors there.
What's that one in the bottom right?
That's the Geth logo.
That's the Geth logo?
Yeah.
Okay, that's something new.
And so I'm not going to. The other thing as well, there's been good funding sources as well for it. Like the Gitcoin continued to fund issues for it. The ECF has funded us for it. The Ethereum Foundation as well too. So we've got a full-time team working on Web3j, which makes up this integration piece. But where it gets slightly more interesting, and this is where we've got some smarter stuff that we've been working on. And so we actually put out a blog post today about a new tool called Socket. And so what Socket does is it means that developers no longer need to actually install Solidity themselves. In its current form right now, it benefits developers on the JVM, but in the coming months, this will benefit people developing more generally with Equus. But the idea with Socket is what it does is it looks at the pragma statements in the top of any Solidity source code. You basically have this pragma which says, we need to have at least Solidity 0.40 and less than this, or it might say, we're happy with the latest version of Solidity that's not like a development release or a snapshot release or whatever else. And so what Socket does is it looks at the pragma, and then regardless of whether you're running on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, it will actually pull down the most current Solidity binaries that are compatible with all of your project Solidity code, and then that's used within your project for compiling it. So if you've got multiple projects and you've got multiple sets of Solidity files there, it will automatically figure out which versions of Solidity you actually need to use there, which simplifies things somewhat, in that it no longer becomes a concern. To help support this as well, we've started hosting some, I think it's Mac OS builds of Solidity as well, because the Ethereum Foundation, they only publish Linux distributions of it. So that's one of the big pieces of the equation that we've kind of solved there, that people don't need to worry about that. And it ties in with the whole kind of build integration pipeline and everything else. So when someone builds their project, then it will do this whole thing and figure out what version of Solidity it needs, pull it down, and then compile the smart contracts. Then from there, it generates the smart contract binding, so it can talk to it on the JVM. But then the other thing it also does is it generates unit tests as well for your smart contracts. So to test the deployment and then all of the different transaction methods and also any of the the view methods as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but I think the technology here that is very cool is what we've done that makes it really easy to write tests to target any specific Ethereum compatible runtime basically. And so, of course, Hyperledger Besu, Geth, Quorum, but and all these other flavors, it's now really simple to switch between different runtimes. So if you're thinking about blockchain in a production context, you don't really want to be developing on a virtual machine that's been written for developers. It's much better if you can actually run against exactly the same target versions that you're going to be running in a production environment, and this is what this enables you to do. So I'm going to show you this is using Kotlin code, but it's pretty self-explanatory. You've got a smart contract test, and you annotate it with @EVM test, and what that does is it gives you an in-memory EVM. It's the EVM that's used by Hyperledger Besu, and so that's there in memory to actually debug and also test all of your smart contracts in memory. So what it means is that when you've got a smart contract or any integration code on the JVM, so Android, Java, and Kotlin, and but we'll be opening that up to other platforms soon. You just add this in, and then you can just run your tests really quickly. Within seconds, you can just test your smart contracts in the JVM, and so that's really all it requires. So if I give you, this is like a hello world test in its entirety. So we've got this EVM test annotation. We've basically got some things that we need to interact with the blockchain here, but these are all injected automatically by this EVM test. So as long as you've got the right build dependencies, this will do everything. This will spin up the in-memory VM. You deploy your smart contract with whatever parameters you want, which is hello blockchain world. You send it, then you check that the value you get back works. So behind the scenes, that's deploying the smart contract to an in-memory EVM. Then it's also calling on that smart contract as well and getting the value back. And again, that's what this EVM test does. Where it gets really interesting is, say you don't want to test against like a in-memory EVM, you'd rather test against Geth. So let's just put node type Geth, and then now you can run your test against a Geth node. So what's different here is it will actually spin up a Dockerized Geth node. And so, out the box though, we provide Geth support, we provide parity support, and we also provide Besu support. So you can spin up those Dockerized environments and vary which one you use just by changing this annotation. But, of course, that doesn't cover all of the nodes. So what about Autonity, Clearmatic's one? So we've got a Docker file which spins up an Autonity node, then we just put in, EVM compose test, and then we point to that, and now you can run all of your tests you've got against Autonity as well. And that's all there is to it. So, again, it's kind of plugs into this whole ethos of making it as simple as possible to do all of this stuff. So when someone creates, a new project using the Epirus SDK, it will generate the smart contracts, it will generate the tests, and all of those generated tests will be using this framework as well. So, if you're not using, the in-memory Besu EVM, you want someone to use a custom Docker file, you tell them to change one line and tell them where the Docker file is, and all of a sudden, all of that stuff's running against your platform, this other node. Good example, say VMware for their Concord clients as well. That's an Ethereum-based one. Put in the Docker Compose file, and then we're able to run all of this stuff against that too. So we just feel that it's very kind of robust tools for testing. And here's just a reminder. So if you did have an Autonity Docker file, again, all of this stuff's exactly the same. It's just that one line that needs to change there. So then, in terms of what this means within the context of Epirus, I know we spoke about 3 commands. There'll also be a test command so that you can actually run your tests as well. And then finally, run as well, which will deploy it. I'm not going to talk about the details of exactly how we do that today, but this is something that will be available with the initial launch. And then, of course, when you've deployed it as well, there's the Epirus Explorer, which gives you nice visualization of your blockchain, be it a public one or a private blockchain. And then if you're using this, when you dig down into the transaction details, you might not all be able to see it here, but you can actually see what the text is there on your contract, because if you're using Epirus to deploy the Epirus SDK and then you deploy it to an environment where you've got an Epirus Block Explorer, then you don't have all of this kind of obscure data there. You know what all of the method names are, the method parameters, and the events names and parameters that are being deployed there. So, kind of overall, we feel it solves all of these problems for developers, and then it makes kind of the whole funnel for getting started with development. And we're thinking very much so, new developers, to bring them into the blockchain space. It distills this down significantly to a few steps. Our official launch will be early Q2, but if someone wants to do any beta testing or whatever else, please feel free to reach out. So either via that email address or speak to me directly about it. Well, thank you.
What is the origin of the word Epirus?
So Epirus was one of the successor states of in the Byzantine Empire. Wow. So that's where it came about. But the reality was, you're trying to find a name that's like kind of blockchainy and
It's not Genesis.
Yeah. The IO domain was available, So
less than 4 syllables.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So you already passed Constantinople and Istanbul.
Yeah. It was
next fork is going to be Epirus, right?
So that's that's the history of it. Not everyone gets the pronunciation right, but this is the only downside to the word.
Yeah, it just sounds like DevOps for smart contracts, but in DevOps you are deploying very frequently your application on production. So does it apply to smart contracts?
So I think that with smart contracts, there's kind of a couple of barriers. One of them is just the complexity of them and getting them right, and that I don't see it being like a mainstream thing that you get, typical developers doing lots of smart contract development. They're more likely to cherry pick the parts they want from those libraries there. So I think that reduces necessarily how heavily they'd be tested, but then the other side is that the patterns people use for actually deploying those smart contracts do vary a lot. So do you use a proxy contract so that you can manage your versions as you deploy each one? I think there's certain patterns that are people are following off the back of work being done by like OpenZeppelin, who are obviously leaders there, but that's I guess my thought there.
I just mean with blockchain, it's a trustless system, but you need to trust the software itself. So if it's changed every time, you can lose this trust. That's the thing I was thinking about regarding DevOps and smart contract. Just ask the question.
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to depend on what your deployment environment is, what you're using it for. Of course, with a consortium, then it's not a consideration because it's not a consideration insofar that you trust the other members of the consortium. When it comes to the public networks, people need to have a degree of faith that that the keys they're using to deploy this haven't been compromised, or someone else hasn't changed done anything malicious really with them. But the way, I guess we don't really see it as any different from like traditional development, in that someone decides on this is how they're going to deploy the smart contracts, or this is how frequently they're going to do it, and then they can use this tooling to do that. But it's I think it certainly has relevance in DevOps, but I think there's just more unknowns right now about whether what is the optimum way to do this stuff.
I mean, I think you want the same kind of easy workflows if you're a developer, because otherwise it's a pain in the arse, basically. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing to have a fast rate of change on smart contracts. I guess the way I'd say it is, it's like we're in the 1980s. Everything is written in C. You've only got GCC. There's no debuggers, no tools, no nothing. Like, you're doing printf debugging, and if you make an error, it core dumps. That's kind of like where we are. So there's no standard libraries, there's no frameworks, there's no best practices. It's just like you're in the guts of the thing, and it's horrible. So I guess any steps that we can have at the moment are like taking us up through the layers, but they're probably not indicative of the final pattern that you'll end up with. Probably the final pattern is that most of these things are going to be domain-specific languages composing libraries of well-written parts. And it will be like, another example would be like, you go back to a time and you're like, everyone's writing a string class, or writing like a vector or a matrix, or like writing like some file loading system or memory system. And it's like, don't do that. Don't ever do that. Like that's solved, right? Apart from it isn't solved yet. So that's kind of where we are. So you do have to go like quicker than you'd like, but it's not because it's a good thing, but that's where we are.
Hello. Truffle is about to come out with Truffle Teams.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like complementary approach.
Yeah.
What's your thought?
So, I mean, with Truffle Teams, from what I understand, it's very much so geared towards the your CI pipelines and CD, where it's more that say you're using whether it's Microsoft's whether you're using Visual Studio Team Server, and whether you're using that, or whether you're using one of the the open source project ones. We're not thinking so much about that space. We're thinking more just about the you're a developer and you actually want to be able to deploy this stuff to a live environment. And that's kind of where we're doing it. Whereas I think they're thinking more from the perspective of we've got this nice CI pipeline integration, and there might be some pushing that they can do there, but I think the developers kind of want to
That's why
control
I'm
it.
saying that it's complementary.
Yeah.
They have a life cycle and you have stages, different deployments possibly.
Yeah.
And you have optimized way of doing that. So.
I mean, we really want to. I mean, one of the things that we'll be releasing in the next few months is on top of the API, the JVM integration. We'll also have something that's RESTful as well there. So then we start to open up, what we're doing to really any your JavaScript, Python, whoever else. As Jim was saying earlier on, about having open API compliance endpoints, it gives more flexibility.